All right, so here we go. We already saw this. We did a little bit of session planning here. So what is the fund? Well, it's $28.6 billion. It is not a loan. It is essentially the closest thing to a grant that most for-profit businesses will ever see. So not a loan, not taxable. And it's fairly open for qualification. So it's not just restaurants, right? Food stands, food trucks, food carts, tasting places like breweries and things like that, catering companies. If you've got two businesses that have, you'll be able to use both businesses and the profit and loss and things like that. So that's good. Really the only people that are not qualified, we show at the top right. As long as you serve food or drink, you're going to qualify. Unless you're quite large, right? You can see at the top right, you have to be 20 or fewer locations. You cannot be a public company. And you need to be in existence as of March 13th, 2020. Now, what in existence means is you have to have spent money at a minimum, have spent some money trying to start your business. So if in January 2020 I said I want to start a catering company and I go and start buying things, I can use the recovery funds to cover the stuff I was buying. The reason they set this date is this is the date on or around the 13th is the date the law passed. So they didn't want to pass the law and then have people say, oh, I'm going to start a restaurant and go out and spend money knowing it can be reimbursed. So you just had to be doing something before the law passed, essentially. The key here is what can you spend the money on? So really any operational expenses the money can be spent on. So it's really easier to say what you cannot spend the money on. So you cannot spend the money on fixed assets. So you can't get a $20,000 grant or a $50,000 grant and then go out and buy a hood and an oven. Now, you could spend that money you can spend the money on loan payments. So if you took out a 2-year loan for an oven, you could spend the money on the loan payments, but you cannot spend all of the money on a fixed asset. Otherwise, pretty much anything that you're spending money on, particularly if you're buying or spending money on cleaning things and things you're doing for COVID, anything like that. But really any operational expense and or cost of goods sold, and of course employee costs and things like that are all things that you're allowed to spend the money on. Now, how much will you get? So in general, if you were open prior to 2019, it is simply your gross sales in 2019 minus your gross sales in 2020 minus whatever you got for PPP loans. Now, if you didn't open until 2019 or didn't open until 2020, I'll get to that in a moment. But this is sort of the baseline formula. So to give you an example, John's Fish House did $8 million in 2019, but only $5 million in 2020, which leaves $3 million short. He got $2.25 million in PPP loans. Therefore, his eligible amount is $1.75 million. So the deficit minus the PPP is everything else that you're eligible for. So it's a pretty generous program. Particularly sort of the worse you did, the more benefit you get. So it's really good in that way. So we had quite a few people actually that responded, I think, that opened during 2019. So I will spend a couple of minutes here. So in 2019, you take the average of your gross monthly sales for the months that you were open, and then multiply that number by 12 and use it as your 2019 gross sales. So I use Kelly's Diner here. They were open for 5 months and did $250,000, which made an average monthly sale of $50,000. 12 times $50,000, because it's 12 months, gets them a rate of $600,000 for 2019. Now, we then subtract the 2020 revenue, which, let's say in this case they only had $400,000, leaves them $400,000, or leaves them $200,000 difference in revenue. They were $200,000 shorter on revenue than they were in 2019. They took no PPP1 draw. They did get $100,000 in PPP2 draw, which means they're eligible for $100,000. Okay, and we can go over your own individual situation in a while if you want to. If you only opened in 2020, basically it's all of your operating expenses minus your sales. So if you open during 2020, you can take all startup eligible expenses, which are outlined in the program guide, minus your gross sales. So here I give an example, $100,000, where you did $75,000 in gross sales. Okay. And then if your business is still not even open yet, basically any eligible startup costs, which is all cost of goods sold except for fixed assets, or all cost of goods, all costs, except for fixed assets, but fixed assets loan payments are allowed. So if you were opening a caterer and you've got a delivery vehicle, all the money you've spent to open that catering business, including the loan payments on the vehicle, would be eligible. So, okay. So when is the eligible expense period? Basically, most of 2020, February 15th, 2020, all the way to December 31st, 2021. So you can spend this, if you've already spent this money, you can essentially reimburse yourself with the funds. So how long will the money last? First come, first serve. It's $28 billion program. $5 billion is reserved for businesses of $500,000 or less. That doesn't mean only $5 billion can be spent on that, but a minimum of $5 billion will be spent on businesses of $500,000 or less. They did that to make sure that those very small companies are recognized and taken care of. But the advantage to women and minority-owned businesses really exists in this particular program, because what the law has done is written into it, for the first 21 days of the application period, only applicants from women-owned businesses, veterans, and socially and economically disadvantaged entities, they all will get to the front of the line as long as they get their applications in during that first 21-day period. So that's a way to assure that you'll get part of that money before it runs out. So that's a big advantage. Now, people have said to me, well, what if I'm not any of those things and I apply during that 21-day period? They will start considering your application at day 22 if you're not any of these groups. But even if you get it on day 2, they're not even going to look at it until day 22. That's how that works. So there was some big news released just this past Saturday about the program. Up until this past Saturday, there wasn't even guidance on how does that one even apply. We weren't even sure of that yet. But on Saturday, some new news came out, and a sample application was released. Now, this is a sample application. They are still not taking applications. However, I and most people in the field expect that within 5 or 10 days, applications are going to open up, and because it's first come, first serve, I recommend you apply as quickly as you possibly can. I do leave a link here, and by the way, I will send an email. I mentioned a whole bunch of resources during this presentation. Excuse me. I will send an email within an hour or two after this call that will give you all of those resources. So don't worry about writing this down or anything like that. I will send you the presentation, I'll send you a link to the recording, and I'll send you links to all of the resources that I mentioned. So anyhow, one of the ways to make sure you get alerted of it, of course, I'll be sending things out, but also I would recommend signing up for the SBA program updates. And really there's a link that I have in here, sba.gov/restaurants. That's continually updated with all of the latest information. It's actually a really good website for this program. But one thing you can do right now is just start getting yourself ready. So the first thing I would do, so you can imagine, as you can imagine, by the relative simplicity of the eligibility, this is not a super complex application. It's far less taxing than doing your taxes. But nevertheless, you need to have backup data. So I would start by downloading the sample application. And just be aware the application is not final. I give you the link here, how to sign up for it, or how to get it. Just be aware the application is not final. It's not impossible that another question or two will be added, or perhaps questions will change wording a little bit to make it more clear. But so you've got a sample application that's available, and there's an application program guide at the link that I give you here, and that's about 21 pages, but it's good because it gives lots of different examples and, tries to lay out if you're in this situation or that situation. It's a bit of an FAQ, so it's pretty good there. And you'll also need to verify tax information. You can complete that form 4506T while you're doing your application on the SBA website. That form is just, all the 4506T is a request for a tax transcript. So it's basically a way that you're approving the SBA to go communicate with the IRS to look at your tax forms. So pretty straightforward. I mean, literally that form 4506T is just filling out your name and your EIN. That's pretty straightforward. So what you're going to want to do now is get some gross receipts documentation. There are many ways to do this. You can use your tax returns, Schedule C. You can even use just your POS reports. So many different ways to do this. I'm not going to read the slide to you because you're going to get this anyhow. But as you start working with your tax accountant or bookkeeper, if you want to work with us to do this, that's fine. But you need to have some access to some official documents that talk about your revenue. And just a couple of quick things here. If you're a brew pub, tasting room, that kind of thing, you need to show that on-site consumption is 33% of your business or more. And the reason for this is if you're primarily a microbrewery that really sells in stores, but you just happen to have a tasting room that is only a few percent, they don't really see that as a valid quote-unquote restaurant. So it's got a different application. So if you're a brew pub, tasting room, things like that, if you're an inn, basically the same thing. You need to show that at least 33% of your revenue comes from the restaurant if you're a bed and breakfast or that kind of thing. So same idea. Some people earlier, when the program was first announced, there was potential to have to in order to qualify, you needed to register with something called sam.gov and get a DUNS number. There was a whole bunch of complex stuff that normally is only done by nonprofits. The National Restaurant Association and the Independent Restaurant Coalition lobbied the SBA to have that requirement removed, because just getting on these sites and getting set up is a pretty significant burden for restaurant owners that are already really busy. So that is not required. So if you've heard something like that before, whoever you're talking to, they may not just have the latest information, because initially that's how people thought it was going to get done. So don't need to have a SAM or a DUNS identifier. By the way, if you've got questions coming up in your head as we're talking, and it may be happening, I can't see the chat right now, but feel free to put them in the chat. Alyssa's going to work with me sort of once I'm done talking, which I'm approaching my 20 minutes. We'll start working those questions. So if you think of questions as I'm talking, just put them in the chat right now so we can deal with them later. So there are two ways that once once applications are open, how is that going to go? One is through the SBA is setting up partnerships with POS companies. So Toast, Upserve, and several others. They have not announced the list yet. So none of us has access to that list. I gave you the websites. I gave you that website in the beginning. That's sort of the resource for all things in the program to find out if your POS system is a restaurant partner, because one of the ways you're going to be able to do this is at the website of your POS company, and that will most likely be a simpler application for you, although we don't really know this until it launches. But they've set up partnerships with these POS companies, because really it's about the gross revenue, not the expense side. So they've set up relationships with the POS companies to actually verify the revenue, essentially. So one way you'll be able to apply if your POS company is an SBA restaurant partner, and we don't know exactly who those are going to be just yet. From what I know, just from what I've read, Toast and Upserve are two examples they give, so I'm guessing those two are in the program. Otherwise, you can apply through the SBA directly at the website that's here, or you can actually do it over the telephone. I've never tried that example, so I don't know what it would look like, but I'm guessing you'd have to wait for someone to answer the phone, which would probably take a long time. And just one last little thing here about this application process. In the 7 days before the application process opens, the SBA is going to do a pilot period where they select a bunch of restaurant owners to do the application, and just to help them work the kinks out of it's basically a beta test. So if you start hearing, oh, I've been able to fill out the application already, those people are just in the testing phase. Their application won't be recognized until day one, just like anybody else's. But just know that if someone tells you they're filling out the application already, and you're pretty sure the application isn't even available yet, they may be in the testing phase. And the participants will only be in those high priority groups that we talked about: women-owned businesses, veteran-owned businesses, and economically disadvantaged. So if you hear of people in those, but you're pretty sure the application hasn't come out yet, that's what's happening there. So just a little timeline. So we're here in mid-April right now, and this has just come out. We're guessing that testing is going to happen over the next week or two, and then high priority businesses will take that 21-day period, and then all businesses, we're thinking starting in mid-May, but again, all this just is based on the date that the application opens. Whatever date that it finally opens, it's, the timeline moves. So these could change. Really quickly, I've got just about 2 minutes left. Some other money sources that I just want to remind you not to forget about. There is the Employee Retention Tax Credit is a very large, advantageous program. Remember, it's a credit, not a deduction, of up to $33,000 per employee that you had during 2020 and the first half of 2021. So this is a huge tax credit. It's fairly complicated. You want to work with your tax professional to help you navigate it, but there's a lot of money available for that. So don't forget to do that. It can be used even if you got PPP loans. Initially, if you got a PPP, you couldn't use the tax credit. Then they changed that rule. So there's been a lot of talk of things like that. So you want to make sure you're getting all the exact latest information. And you can even get the tax credit retroactive to 2020 for items that were not initially announced until very late in 2020. You can take it and actually go and potentially get more money back. So a lot you can do there. Also, don't forget the PPP loans were extended to May 31st. So there's still PPP loans out there. And also at the bottom right here, don't forget that restaurants get 3.5 times average payroll. Every other industry got only 2.5, but restaurants were hit harder. So during the PPP 2 rollout, they allowed restaurants to actually use a higher multiplier to get more money in their pockets. And idle loans have also gone up. So idle loans, there's a lot of good ways to use idle loans. I often recommend people use them just as a cash flow buffer, because you basically can get the money and use it just like have the pile of money in the bank, use it like a line of credit. When you're done with it, give it back, because it's very low interest, and it's a real good source of funds that are pretty easy to get. So really the big takeaway that I'm trying to make a point of here is if your business was down more than 25% in 2019 from 2020 from 2019, and if you utilize this stimulus package, PPP, idle, employee retention tax credit, there's no reason at least 30, if not 45 or 50% or more of all your operating expenses shouldn't be paid through stimulus funds. It's just a question of allocating the expenses correctly for the various programs. If you allocate expenses correctly, you can get a lot of your expenses paid for all of 2020. So, important to know. And really, just the brief advertisement part here, I'm just a tiny bit over time. Why Food Creators Financial? Because this is all we do, is focus on helping restaurants stay open right now, make money, optimize revenue, optimize. This is all we do, is food businesses. So this is why every other bookkeeper is not doing what we're doing right now, because we spend a lot of time learning everything and knowing everything that's going on in the industry. And we talked about who we are. Don't need to spend a whole lot of time on this. My program, Wyndham Grows, won the 2019 Vermont Business for Social Responsibility, Innovation and Inspiration Award. Have raised millions of dollars for that which was a nonprofit. I've also helped over 50 businesses raise several $million, and QuickBooks Online Certified Pro Advisor. Alyssa, as we talked about, has been in the business forever. So we know food, and we feel it's what differentiates us from every other accountant, bookkeeper out there. So, next time you're looking for one of those, we hope you'll talk to us. What do you want to do now? There's an email going to be coming from me with a link to this presentation, copy of the slides, and links to all the important resources. If you want to contact us, here's the contact information. You can feel free to contact myself or Alyssa. And I am at 23 minutes. So went just a little bit over, but hopefully everyone got what they needed.